Hey there, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends. I just wanted to pop up to put what you're about to watch in context and do two quick shameless plugs. For the last several months, I have been teaching a Zoom class on all three volumes of Marx's Capital through the GTAA Patron. Right now, we're 24 chapters in. We're going to be starting chapter 25 next Sunday. And by the way, first shameless plug, anytime you want to join that class, you can always head over to the Patreon and, join us midway. Every single recording for, our class discussions of all 24 chapters we've covered so far are, available to you as soon as you sign up for the class. And I pretty regularly post that link, so you won't miss it. And of course, we've got, as far as joining us, for the classes that are left, we've still got 9 chapters left of volume 1 and then all of volumes 2 and 3. So, it's certainly not too late. Meanwhile, second shameless plug, if you live in or near Los Angeles, I'm actually going to be doing a free in-person version of the class starting tomorrow. That's Wednesday, January 22nd. We'll be meeting at Cafe Mock, which is a coffee shop in LA's Koreatown. The class is free and open to everybody, but I have created an Eventbrite link just to keep track of the numbers in case we need to move to a bigger venue. I think the space in the back of Mock they've let us reserve for the class is a little on the small side, and I don't particularly expect that to be an issue, right? That there's going to be such a mass outpouring of people who want to read Capital that we'll have to move to a different, different venue, but just in case. So I've got the Eventbrite link at the beginning of this description for this video, or rather, our super producer Jake will have put the Eventbrite link in the description for this video. He's much more on top of shit than I am anyway. So in any case, that's it for the plugs. Here's the context. Last Saturday, Matt McManus, who's probably the most frequent guest in the history of this show, came to LA, and we did an event at a brewery in North Hollywood where I interviewed him about his new book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. We'll also have a link to that book in the description for this video. And yes, we recorded the discussion at the brewery. That will be making it up to YouTube, right, to this channel very, very soon. Maybe it'll be part of the season premiere this coming Monday night. Maybe we'll put it up before then. Honestly, I'm not too sure about that part yet. But one way or the other, I promise, within a week, you'll be able to watch that. In any case, Matt was staying with me over the weekend, so I roped him into guest co-lecturing for my Zoom class last Sunday. And I realized as soon as we were done that even though normally the class recordings just live on, Patreon, this one would be a really good one to put on YouTube, because honestly it kind of felt like a podcast anyway, right? Because it was the sort of two of us talking for a lot of it instead of me just lecturing. And I don't think you need to have read chapter 24, which is what we were talking about, never mind the earlier 23 chapters, to follow the discussion. It's just a good, fun, wide-ranging conversation where we refer to a lot of things he says in the chapter, but I think we give it adequate context, and and a lot of it's talking about other philosophers who sort of come up over the course of talking about Marx in the Capital chapter. And even if you've never read a page of Capital, I think you can follow along, and it might whet your appetite to read some Capital, right? To start turning some of those pages. I hope so. And if it does whet your appetite to do that, and you live in Southern California, maybe I will see you on Wednesday evening. That's 7 o'clock, Cafe Mock. Sign up at that Eventbrite link if so. But in any case, I think that is enough intro. Enjoy the discussion, and I'll see everybody next Monday for the first episode of GTAA. Season 7. So we're going to do this a little bit differently today, since Matt McManus is in town. He came to give a do a live podcast yesterday at a brewery in North Hollywood, uh, where the you know nobody was engulfed by flames. So it's a successful event.
Well, let's get real. I came here to avoid the Michigan winter and get some sunshine, and I achieved both those objectives. So it's been very nice.
Fair enough. So anyway, since we are lucky enough to have Matt with us today, instead of doing a normal sort of lecture discussion period thing, I have I've got some notes, right. I'll start us up, but then there are a few points where I thought it'd be interesting to pull in Matt's perspectives. We'll do that, and we'll kind of see how it goes. And at a certain point, start I think maybe if people want to like ask questions during it, instead of kind of doing the usual clean division between the lecture and discussion, if people want to just kind of jump in, as the spirit takes them, I think that's well within the spirit of what we're doing right now. But in any case, let's get this started. So uh, I think that it's worth taking a minute here to recap some of what was going on in chapter 23 and some of what is coming up in chapter 25, to see how the chapter 24 fits into the scheme here. Right. So going back to chapter 23, right? This was about simple reproduction, uh, which means that the sort of Marx is constantly doing simplifying assumptions throughout Capital, that that he'll bracket away features of the system that he doesn't want to look at. So he says, all right, let's just like a one that he makes constantly is, right, let's assume that everything is being sold at its value. He obviously knows that it's not, as we've discussed many times, but says, for the sake of, it's like almost like a word problem in a math or physics class. We're just sort of like simplifying away everything that's not what we want to talk about here, so we can kind of train our analytic microscope on like just the factors that we want to talk about. But the big extra one that he's doing for the sake of the simple reproduction factor is that what's left of capitalist profits after what goes into the variable capital fund, right, which remember just means the fund out of which workers' wages are paid, and replenishing the means of production at their current level, is everything at all the profits that are left after those two things, right, are just a fund for the personal consumption of capitalists, right. It's just you replenish the means of production, so they're not deteriorating, but they're also not expanding. You can continue to pay workers' wages, but everything beyond that is yachts and blow, right. That's the assumption for the sake of argument in this chapter. And so what that adds up to is that when he's giving you this model of simple capitalist reproduction, he is assuming that capital is not accumulating. Uh, which obviously he knows is unrealistic. One of the most important things about capital is that it does accumulate, right? That's what we're talking about in chapters 24 and 25. But this unabashedly unrealistic model of a static capitalism still showed us a bunch of interesting things about how the system works. And to my mind, the most important of those is, even assuming for the sake of argument that capitalism originates in a state of Nozikian purity, it's still based on the systematic exploitation of the working class. In other words, even if the first tank of gas in the variable capital fund is filled, however you like it, right, through, he says, we could assume that the capitalist was once a worker and was just like really thrifty with their savings, right, that whatever happened there, it is still the case that that fund is constantly replenished by the workers themselves, right? So that the funds out of which the capitalists are paying them are generated by the workers themselves, and so is everything else.
Yeah, there's a nice metaphor for that in the next chapter where he talks about how essentially what's happening is you have a conqueror who is paying his subjects with the money that he's stolen from them.
Right, exactly. And so at the end of the last chapter, said capitalist reproduction therefore reproduces in the course of its own process the separation between labor power and the conditions of labor, right? The that the worker is unable to support themselves, and they are and they are providing the funds with which the capitalists own the means of production, and are able to employ them. Thereby reproduces and perpetuates the conditions under which the worker is exploited. It incessantly forces him to sell his labor power in order to live, as it enables the capitalist to purchase labor power in order that they may enrich himself. It is no longer a mere accident that the capitalist and the worker confront each other in the market as buyer and seller. Remember, that's where that iconic passage at the end of chapter 6 about the money owner and the labor power owner meeting each other in the market, which is this Eden of the rights of man, and then leaving as the worker and the capitalist, right? It says, all right, well, at this stage of the analysis, it's no longer a mere accident that they confront each other in the market as buyer and seller. It is the alternating rhythm of the process itself, which throws the worker back onto the market again and again as a seller of his own labor power, and continually transforms his own product into a means by which another man can purchase him. In reality, the worker belongs to capital before he has sold himself to capitalist. His economic bondage is at once mediated through and concealed by the periodic renewal of the act by which he sells himself, his change of masters, and the oscillations in the market price of his labor. So the capitalist process of production, therefore, seen as a total connected process, i.e. a process of reproduction, it's continually cycling. It's not accumulating yet, right? That comes in chapter 24, but it's continually cycling. Produces not only commodities, this is the key point, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, capitalist, on the other, the wage laborer. Okay, so that's all with this like simple static model of the simple reproduction model. But now that we're bringing accumulation into the picture, we're setting up chapter 25 on the general law of capitalist accumulation, which is the chapter that we'll probably be spending the next month on, because it's a beast. It's like 100 and something pages. I don't really remember exactly, but it's a very, very long chapter. And what that chapter is going to be on is the general dynamics of capitalist accumulation, which in a certain way culminates Marx's analysis of the dynamics of capitalism as it is, before he switches for the rest of the volume, right? Because this chapter 25 is going to be the last chapter of part 7, right? So all that's left in volume 1 is part 8, which is about primitive accumulation, right? This is it turns out that first tank of gas doesn't just come from thriftiness, right? The historical origins of capitalism, that's the famous lines about how capital emerges into this world dripping blood and dirt from every pore and all that stuff. So he's about to get to that, right? That starts in chapter 26. So chapter 25, we're finishing up the analysis of the system, in its dynamics as it operates once it's already going. But I also do think, right? So David Harvey, who I know I've given a hard time on a couple of other issues in the course of this class, on some of the dialectic stuff, his comments on analytical Marxism, etc. But I think I've always said when I did that I still think everybody should read the companion. There's tons of good stuff in there. And I think that when he sets up, right, in this part of the companion, when he sets up chapter 25, I think he has a really useful note of caution about how to take the analysis that's coming up in that chapter, right? So what Harvey says is in chapter 25, right, a whole battery of earlier insights are brought together to create what we might now call a series of models of capitalist dynamics. It is vital, however, in reading, part 7, right, that's what we're in, that's what's culminating in chapter 25, to bear in mind the nature of the assumptions. Marx's conclusions are not universal statements, but contingent findings based on and limited by his assumptions. We forget this at our peril. There are far too many commentaries on Marx's work, both favorable and unfavorable, that pass over into serious misinterpretation because they neglect the impact of his assumptions. One of the most famous theses that's advanced in chapter 25, for example, is that of the tendency towards the increasing immiseration of the proletariat, the production of ever greater class inequality. This thesis is contingent on Marx's assumptions, and when those assumptions are relaxed or replaced, the thesis does not necessarily hold. And Marx is very aware that once you bring in these complicating factors, there are counter tendencies. It's not necessarily going to play out this way. So Harvey says, I get extremely irritated with attempts to prove or disprove Marx's findings in these chapters, as if he were setting out his conclusions as universal truths rather than as contingent propositions. And then the next bit of Harvey, which we're skipping, he talks about some of those simplifying assumptions that Marx could be continuing to make through chapter 25, the most important of which is that everything gets sold, right? That there's no overproduction or underproduction, that all of the products being manufactured are sold, which of course Marx is extremely aware is not is not how it works, right? In fact, a lot of volume 2 is about the fact that it's not how that works, right? And a lot of volume 2, the sort of simplifying assumptions that Marx is setting up in volume 1 are dropped, but there are other things that Marx is exploring in volume 1 that are sort of held constant, right? Because he's looking at other stuff. So going back a few paragraphs later, yeah.
Do you mind if I make an introduction here?
Please, yeah.
This is actually a kind of a useful point to interject and talk a little bit about where this part is situated in the structure of the book. So Marx legendarily was extremely meticulous in planning, not just the details of Capital's chapters, but the overall architectonic of the book, which has always surprised people since many are really kind of baffled at the structure of Capital. Why is it that what seems like the opening chapter on primitive accumulation is stuck at the end? And I think this is where we really need to appreciate the Hegelian nature of Capital, which I know you're a little bit more skeptical of, because to my mind, what this is really trying to do is look at Capital through different lenses, or to use Harvey's terms, windows, right? And Capital Volume 1 is really focused on the spheres of production and to a certain extent exchange. And Marx is extremely aware of the fact that there's an awful lot more that goes into the totality of capital than production or exchange.
Yeah, and even exchange is 99% left in the background of volume 1.
Absolutely, right? So what we're really looking at, if you want to put it very simply, is capital from the perspective of the factory, right? What's going on when we make things, and the different ideas that are kind of gestating in everyone's head when they're making things, whether they're workers, whether they're capitalists, et cetera, along, of course, with material processes. And this is one of the reasons why it is okay for Marx, he thinks, certainly, to make these kinds of simplifying assumptions. There's 2 reasons, right? One is, of course, for his own kind of analytical purposes of simplifying what's going on, but also because he points out consistently, these are the kinds of assumptions that the people who are seeing capital through this window are themselves making, right? You're not going to start producing things unless you think that somebody is going to be out there to buy them.
Right.
And you're not going to go to work unless you think you're going to get paid a wage, et cetera, right? And Marx says, all that might very well not be true. You might produce a whole bunch of stuff and nobody wants to buy it. But just for the purposes of understanding what's going on right now, this is what we're going to assume. Now, the reason I would argue, and this is controversial, that the book ends with primitive accumulation is really quite grandiosely in the way that Hegel ends the phenomenology of spirit with absolute knowing. And then says, but we've only just begun this journey. Now we actually have to apply this method of thinking about things to the world itself, not just to the process of thought. Marx is saying now we need to step out of the factory and really look at how the material bases of this system of production was established historically. Right? You're kind of exiting out into the real world for the first time. And he says that's when you realize, of course, as you said,
Right.
that all of this didn't come about because of these very simple economic laws where people just decided to meet in the market and buy and sell labor. It happened because of these immensely complicated and often extremely bloody historical processes. And that's, of course, what we need to grasp at the end of the book. And I think it's really an enlightened way of structuring capital.
Yeah, I mean, so this gets into stuff that I did want to like. I have a couple of like things teed up for you on that come up in over the course of chapter 24 about Hegelian dialectics and how to think about
Your favorite dialectic.
the relationship the relationship between that and what Marx is saying here, right? And so I think part of the issue is like, okay, is this like how much of what we're talking about, this is like a huge question, right? How much of what we're talking about is like a kind of framing device, right? That there's because like, look, I mean, the same way that Marx is Marx's presentation in Capital is very heavily influenced by I don't know the Bible and Balzac and what's as Roberts would point out, Dante, right? That like, yeah, look, I mean, obviously, he's got tons of Hegel in his head, and like, so there's this sort of, how much we're talking about a sort of mode of presentation, that there's a sort of like pattern of like how to like set things up, right? That's in his head because of all the Hegel, and how much of this sheds light and in what way, right? On the structure of the argument, right? So I think maybe that's I think maybe that's something we'll loop back to, but yeah, so I think so Harvey, yeah, sorry,
If I could just add this there. One of the reasons why I think it's important to stress the structure of the book and the situatedness of chapters 23, 24, 25 in the book, anticipating what's going to come. It's also important to remember that Marx was a German professor, first and foremost, for better and for worse, sometimes very much for worse. And that means, of course, he's very sensitive to the mode of presentation of any kind of argument that he's making, especially in his large academic books, the same way that Kant, Hegel, etc., were all very concerned about the structure of their presentation. And I think this is a good point to kind of remind everyone about the subtitle to Das Kapital, a critique of political economy. And one of the reasons I tend to foreground the kind of Hegelian aspect of this book is precisely to understand what is meant by this term critique, right? Critique does not just mean criticism, although there's plenty of criticism of capitalism, needless to say, in Marx, right? Critique is about exposing how generative categories of understanding emerge and recognizing their productive limitations. And productive limitations are genuinely productive, right? It helps capitalists and workers in a system like capitalism to understand the world this way. Because there's real impacts to it. And this is where Marx is, of course, materialist rather than idealist. But it's also important, to your point about the contingency of these things, to recognize that as productive as they are limited because they are historically contingent categories of understanding rather than eternal trans-historical truths. And we need to recognize that much like at a certain point, the relations of production become fetters on the technologies that are used in production, right? This is the famous contribution to the critique of political economy. So too do our modes of cognition in capitalism become fetters on our understanding of the real world. And of course, Marx thinks that he's exposing that through a new kind of science that he's developing.
Yeah, I mean, Marx's view on science in general, right? I mean, Marx says a bunch of things about science and also about philosophy, which, it's the 19th century. We're not always making the, tightest distinction between those two things, right? But like, is that, science, philosophy, critique, whatever, right? That like these things Marx consistently says, like, where they have their role to play is like when there are gaps between appearance and reality, right? That's like the the mission statement of science is to, expose and close those gaps, right? Or, again, philosophy, critique, whatever. So, I mean, this is even, I think, the way to understand the what Marx says, like go way back in the theses on Feuerbach, about how the philosophers are merely trying to understand the world. The point is to change it, which is like very stirring, and like a lot of people just kind of like take that quote as like a way of saying changing the world, yay,
Yeah.
right? But like,
I mean, he is kind of saying that too.
no, he is that's definitely part of what he's saying, right?
Yeah.
But like, it's also, I think that like there's also a thing that's worth taking a step back and being like, well, wait a second. Why is that the job of philosophers specifically, right? Like, and I think I mean, any more than any other category of, person, right? And I think the answer is that, he thinks that I mean, and this is like, I think this is in Capital, right? The stuff about like commodity fetishism and all that stuff, right? He thinks that there are some illusions that you can't puncture by giving them an argument, that you have to that like
That
because
better auto criticism.
yeah. That you have to change, like in order to eliminate the illusion, you have to change the social structure that gives rise to the illusion, right? So like the sort of job of philosophy in closing gaps between appearance and in reality, like can't be done purely intellectually, right? Like you have to actually change society to do it, right? So
And if I could just add, well, there's two things I want to add. First off, it's very hard to take what you're saying seriously when you cheer for such a shitty football team, but I'll do my best. But yeah. Anyway, it's quite important to stress just how radical and innovative an idea this is, and I think that a lot of people don't always appreciate that when they're trying to evaluate Marx as a philosopher. By the way, this is a point Alan Wood made. I don't agree with everything in his book on Marx's philosophy, but I think this was insightful. Where he says, look, going back to Plato, the traditional approach of philosophers is to say that, well, how do you break through illusions? You do so through thinking through them the right way, which is very much a kind of idealist instinct. And that's a truth that goes all the way through Kant up through Hegel, right?
yeah,
All of whom, of course, influenced Marx, and he's very well aware of. But what Marx does that's extremely, I think, insightful is to suggest no, just thinking through the social illusions that emerge in any historical epoch is not going to be sufficient to break them for a lot of people because they don't emerge because people are thinking about the world in the wrong way. They emerge because these social and material conditions within which they exist stamp their processes of cognition in extremely important ways. So in order to get rid of the illusions, you need to change the social and material conditions, broadly speaking.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, everyone has pointed out that there are some tensions here. Like, how did Marx himself manage to break through all these illusions, despite the kind of social forces at work, et cetera, et cetera? Whereas Marxism itself situated in this analytic. But I still think that this is a real indicator of just how radically innovative Marx is from a philosophical perspective and breaking with what really was a 2,000-year-old tradition at this point. And shifting the conversation in another direction. That's been very productive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way to answer that question about where Marxism itself fits in, to bring in my boy Jerry Cohen, is that
you like G.A. Cohen?
Yeah, we should talk about him someday. He says this, he might use this analogy in the appendix to Karl Marx Theory of History. He definitely talks about it in the Gifford lectures. If you're an egalitarian, how come you're so rich? Which, as I always tell people, is an aspirational title for me. I want to get to the point in life where that's
where you could choose to get rid of some of that money, right?
That's a good way to own me, is to ask that question, right? But you've seen where I live, but
I have, yeah.
In any case,
I was sitting there, I'm like, this is an awfully small bedroom, and this is where the only thing that you have. Wow.
There's come on. There's a good sized closet in Rosarito too. But
that's true.
In any case, yeah, it's but in there, right? Like he uses the analogy about mirages, right? That a mirage in a desert is very unlike, say, a hallucination you have while you're on like mushrooms or something, where it's like you realize that like what you're looking like as, is it real? And once you realize that, like like
Yeah.
it goes away, right? You stop seeing you stop seeing it. Whereas, the mirage,
Or in the case of a lot of my friends, you're like, oh, I still have enough cognizance of the way reality works. I gotta take more mushrooms, right? So that way I really buy into these hallucinations.
it's one way to go.
Yeah.
There's yeah, that's the and then 5 years later you're Sid Barrett, but
Yeah,
and,
there you go.
but,
That's real insider.
but uh but yeah, like whereas like a mirage, like you can intellectually understand all you want that it's not real, you still see it, right? Like and so I think that there's I think that at least in some cases, I wouldn't necessarily claim that this works for like every instance of Marx saying this, right? But I think at least in some cases, I think, commodity fetishism, stuff like that, I think his view might be like, yeah, look, I understand intellectually and I can convince you intellectually that this is misleading. Doesn't mean that in my day-to-day life or your day-to-day life, we're not still going to perceive things this way, because like we totally are. You can't help it. So I think there might be a way of splitting the difference on some of these cases. It's not like
I think so. I mean, this is where it's important to talk about this in terms again of generative or productive limitations, right? And Kant is exactly the same way, right? Where Kant would say, look, it is not just because we need to apprehend the world according to the transcendental intuitions and we cannot know things in themselves doesn't mean that the transcendental intuitions themselves are A, not real, right? That's actually
right,
the way that we cognize things, or B, useless, right? If we couldn't apprehend the world according to the transcendental intuitions of space and time, then boy, oh boy, would we be fucked.
right,
Pretty much three ways from sideways. Similarly, Marx is going to point out, right, it really is the case that if you wear something like a Gucci bag, right, people will treat you differently because of the kind of fetishes they attach to these objects. People are not wrong to want them in order to acquire kind of social status or glamour to themselves. The problem is that they reify these objects and assume that they're intrinsic within them, while not recognizing that it's actually the social conditions that give rise to the kind of fetish or glamour that's inherent within these objects, or that's ascribed, excuse me, to these objects.
yeah, yeah. I think that's right. So, and I think like you mentioned the subtitle, right? It's the critique of political economy, right?
Mhm.
I think that this is a point. So I'd say two things about that. One is that I think some of
Thank you.
on some of this, right? Roberts, whose book I have many issues with, but I think I think that I think when he's good, he's very good. Is has a nice breakdown of like different things that means in capital, right? And I think that like some of that does mean critique in the sense of criticism that not just of capitalism but of political economy, as in the sense of like you know economics as an intellectual discipline. Um, but uh, but and yeah, the Roberts breakdown of like the different levels of criticism there is very good. But then I also think, yeah, some of it, like critique in the relevant sense, uh, doesn't just mean criticism. I mean, and so like think here about like in chapter 15, there's a line in a footnote where Marx says, we don't really have a good, critical history of technology yet. A critical history of technology would reveal, right? And of course, if you read that in context, right? Because like, I mean, the rest of the sentence is like a critical history of technology would reveal that none of the, great inventors of the late 18th century really did their inventions by themselves, that it was all collaborative, like it's, whatever, very
I mean,
standard.
that's pretty relevant today when we see people who treat Elon Musk like he's Tony Stark because he made a couple of good investments back in the day, right?
Yeah, exactly. But like, so like critical history of technology doesn't mean a history that is like a history that has a negative assessment of technology, right? Like it means a history that doesn't sort of rest content with official myths and sort of digs into the real underlying causal structure of things, right? Like, and I think that that's a lot of the sense of critique, right? And
Absolutely.
critique of political economy, that we're, digging down into the real causal structure of things, which maybe looping back. Yeah.
Actually, I think this is a good place where we can make a comment that relates back to the chapter we're
Yeah.
normally supposed to be talking about, since we should probably get back on topic. Marx in 24 refers incessantly to a vulgar economist or apologist or bourgeois economist, right? And a lot of this is
Yeah.
a lot of fun. There's no doubt about that, right? I read this again in preparation for this class, and I was like, boy, oh boy, does it really go after them in this chapter. But there is actually a kind of technical meaning to this idea of vulgar economists, and a contrast with more sophisticated bourgeois economists like John Stuart Mill, who he has not exactly nice things to say about, but is not quite as harsh about.
We'll get there, yeah.
Yeah, so we can get into that later on. But in the Grundrisse, Marx points out, look, it's not that the more sophisticated bourgeois economists like Adam Smith, like Ricardo, like John Stuart Mill, aren't talking about true economic laws when they're describing them. A lot of what they have to say, if it's not empirically inaccurate, has great relevance to the capitalist mode of production. And you can learn a lot by understanding them and working through their work, as Marx himself did. The problem, of course, is their failure to recognize two important facts. The first one is, again, the historicity of these laws, which they tend to ascribe a transcendent and transhistorical status. And the second part is, of course, that their own cognition of these laws is engendered by those historical and material conditions. And they're unreflective about that, precisely for the first reason, that they take them to be transhistorical, right? And this is, again, to your point about why it can be useful to read Adam Smith and David Ricardo, even as a Marxist, because they will tell you things about how the actual capitalist economy works, not to mention how we can think through it according to its own rhythm and blues, as it were. The problem, again, is just ascribing a kind of necessity to that's transhistorical, which is when you run into certain kinds of problems.
Yeah, and you should also read Smith and Ricardo, because you're going to understand Marx a lot better if you understand the views of the people he's arguing against.
Yeah, whereas like vulgar economists, like pretty much everyone who isn't Smith, Ricardo, and Mill, they tend to not only take for granted the kind of transcendent nature of the laws of capitalism, they're also unrelentingly apologetic about them, and are very clearly motivated by class biases.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot in this chapter also, where there are people who sit there and be like, if only we could make people as poor as they are in France, right? The people in France will just really work for nothing. We got to set out to do this, and here's how to do it. We're going to talk about how all you need to eat is gruel and corn every single day, and people can live off of that.
Yeah. Also really, really fun that France is this is not the first chapter it's come up, that is the go-to example of the cheap labor country, which is maybe a nice reminder of the fact that which country's labor is cheap and at which time is not, in fact, as Curtis Yarvin would insist, part of just a transcendental function of national character, but has to do with a bunch of historically contingent things, and in fact can be changed by class struggle. But
I know, when I was reading this chapter, it kind of reminded me of basically Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro, right? Not a week goes by where I don't see them being like, Americans are so goddamn lazy. And I keep on hearing about how people want to retire when they're 70. Why can't you just work until, you're 75 or 80? I intend to work, Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh as a podcaster right until I drop. And I just don't understand why construction workers and coal miners can't do the same.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, on those construction workers and coal miners, right? So chapter 25, Harvey says most famously, you're going to get this immiseration thesis, but Marx himself recognizes that the extent to which things are going to play out this way is contingent, that, he's making certain simplifying assumptions. He understands perfectly well that when you drop those assumptions, you do get counter tendencies, and, it's much more complicated. And so Harvey says, Marx assumes a closed system in which capital circulates in a normal way, right? Normal way means like every single product is sold. This is an important and obviously restrictive assumption. What we are left with is a stripped down model of the dynamics of capital accumulation derived from the theory of absolute and relative surplus value operating in a closed system. The model turns out, though, to be very revealing of certain aspects of capitalism, which I think is exactly the right sort of balanced way to put this. Okay, so moving into chapter 24 itself, um, you know, we are putting accumulation in the picture now, right? We're saying, okay, we, we're introducing in this chapter a simple model of accumulation, right? 10,000 pounds are invested, 2,000 pounds of surplus are gained and reinvested. In this chapter, by the way, chapter 23, we were assuming that the entirety of the capitalist profits was like, after we replenished to stasis, was just a fund for the capitalist personal consumption. Now we're pretending for most of the chapter that like 0% of it is personal consumption, and the capitalist is just like starving himself to like reinvest it all into the business. At the end of the chapter, he has some stuff to say about how, okay, obviously it's both, and in fact there's like an interesting dynamic about capitalists having this kind of like Faustian, tug and pull of like, okay, how much do I spend on consumption and how much do I reinvest in the business? And early, early Manchester manufacturers, lots of them were Quakers, which helped, with the like constant abstinence, and later you get the more showy, conspicuous consumption, right? And whatever. I think there's been an ebb and flow of both of those throughout lots of the history of capitalism. So he introduces all this with his typical literary flair. They're the biblical analogies. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, right? The money being reinvested is begatting, more money. And in the course of laying all this out, right, he recaps a key point from chapter 23, and then he relates it to accumulation. So it says the original capital was formed by the advance of 10,000 pounds. Where did the owner get it from? From his own labor and that of his forefathers, is the unanimous answer of the spokesman of political economy. And in fact, their assumption appears to be the only one consonant with the laws of commodity production, right? So, because remember, one of the big things he's been doing throughout the 24 chapters we've looked at so far in this book is, I mean, look, the first 3 chapters are about the sort of general principles of market exchange in general, and and even when we move into like, okay, how does capitalist profit work, even when we move into his theory of exploitation, we're still assuming that everybody's following what he'll often refer to as like the laws of exchange. And he says, yeah, look, if we were just going to keep that in place, I guess consistent with the laws of exchange, it has to be that they were just really thrifty and they saved up all this money. But of course, part 8, we're going to learn better. And says, but it was quite otherwise with regard to the additional capital of 2,000 pounds, the surplus value. We know perfectly well how that originated. There is not one single atom of its value that does not owe its existence to unpaid labor. The means of production with which the additional labor power is incorporated, as well as the necessities with which the workers are sustained, are nothing but the component parts of the surplus product. Parts, this is the passage that Matt was referring to earlier of the tribute annually extracted from the working class by the capitalist class. Even if the latter uses a portion of that tribute to purchase the additional labor power at its full price, so equivalent exchange for equivalent, again, we're not violating the laws of market exchange, the whole thing still remains the age-old activity of the conqueror who buys commodities from the conquered with the money he has stolen from them.
You can almost see him writing that down and kind of smirking to himself, just being like, oh, that's a good line. That's a killer line.
Yeah, it's a lot of those. Then, a couple paragraphs later, he says the capitalist may even convert the additional capital into a machine that throws the producers of that capital out of work and replaces them with a few children.
Nice.
In every case, the working class creates by the surplus labor of one year the capital destined to employ additional labor in the following year. And this is what is called, another smirk line, creating capital out of capital. Right? Okay. So, and this is one of the things that I wanted to get Matt in on, because there's a passage here, we already kind of previewed that Matt tends to lean into the Hegel of it all much more than I do, right? So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about this passage with him, right? Since as he's unpacking this last point, right? He starts to get very Hegelian in his presentation here. He says, originally the rights of property seem to us to be grounded in a man's own labor. Some such assumption at least was necessary, since only commodity owners with equal rights confronted each other, and the sole means of appropriating the commodities of others was an alienation of man's own commodities which, however, could only be produced by labor. Now, however, property turns out to be the right on the part of the capitalist to appropriate the unpaid labor of others or its product, and the impossibility on the part of the worker of appropriating his own product. The separation of property from labor thus becomes the necessary consequences of a law that apparently originated in their identity. Therefore, however much the capitalist mode of appropriation may seem to fly in the face of the original law of capitalist production, it nevertheless arises not from a violation of those laws, but on the contrary from their application. And it seems to me that, I mean, the way he's setting this up, right, is like that this is you could feel some of the Hegel leaking through here, that the the opposite of the thing emerges from its identity, with the thing itself, right? And so this, I mean, there's sort of, I guess one way of thinking about this is there's a range of views you could have on like how to think about all of the Hegelian framing, going from like on one extreme, you have like Richard Rorty, who has this
Your favorite guy.
Yeah, my favorite guy, famously. Yeah, I was years ago. Matt was moderating a debate that I was in, and he sort of tried to throw in a question in an effort, I think, actually to lower the temperature and find common ground about like, oh well, how about like Rorty? He says,
You,
well,
you were arguing with a postmodernist.
Yeah.
Somebody was defending, those kinds of approaches, and I could tell you were just kind of like, I want nothing to do with this. Like, fuck all that. And I was like, wow, we need to do something to make this a little more productive than just staring at each other and yelling at cross purposes. So I was like, oh, Rorty, he's a nice kind of analytical philosopher who nonetheless is really sympathetic to Derrida and Foucault and all those others. Maybe we'll kind of bridge the divide between the two of you by appealing to them. And yeah, Ben was just not going to have any of it.
Yeah, I didn't actually say fuck that guy too, but I mean that was kind of
He was a nice guy.
that was kind of the gist of it. But yes, when less irritated, I will. I do find. I mean, I think there's some extremely silly shit in Rorty sometimes. It's the truth is what you can get away with. All that stuff.
It's a compliment you pay to a sentence that works well, right?
Yeah. But he does. I think if you read his essay collections, especially, he does have a lot of that. I think he says a lot. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
And I'd also point out, because I agree with you about Rorty saying a lot of silly things, but I tend to like him better than you do. This is way off topic, so we should get back. But in Achieving Our Country, which is written in the 1990s, Rorty is like, one day, working class people will probably get really frustrated at all these stuffy-headed liberal professors and their identity politics. And they're going to get angry that they keep on lecturing them about being better. And they might turn to a kind of demagogic type figure who will promise to do away with all this political correctness and restore the country to greatness. And I was like, wow, a lot of people criticize Rorty for not having a kind of sufficiently theorized political framing, but he seems to have had some pretty good instincts on that point. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, look, and I should also say Rorty has, I mean, he started out, political life as like a teenage socialist, and
I don't think he ever dropped that. Even in a couple of his essays later on, he was like, I'm still kind of an Irving Howe type person. Somebody actually asked me once, like, is Rorty a liberal socialist? And I was like, probably.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't really want to write about that.
I'm not totally sure. I mean, I think that there is stuff that's scattered around that at least seems very like solidly social democratic. He really likes labor unions. There's stuff I can get behind in like the sort of political snippets here and there. But yeah, so like Rorty and his essay on Derrida's Spectres of Marx, right? So Rorty takes the sort of like one flamboyantly extreme end of the spectrum on this question, right? He says it's it's a shame that the most important political economist of the 19th century was a philosophy major at college. And so that's like, yeah, that's like one extreme end, just be like, okay, this is all just this kind of like unfortunate like accretion, that ends up in Marx, and like everything that's like worthwhile, you sort of get to by like just kind of scrubbing this off, right? Like that's one end of the spectrum, right? And then there's another end of the spectrum, which is, there are any number of Marxists who will tell you that the dialectical method, right, is this distinctive way of arriving at the truth. And if I think, for example, about like Trotsky, right? Like in Trotsky's essay, The ABCs of Materialist Dialectics, right? He says, Marxism without the dialectic is like a clock without a spring, right? That there's that, like, this is again the sort of special insight, that I guess, I guess Hegel had without the materialism, but like the special insight about like how to arrive at the truth of how, history, social systems, whatever work. And that this is just a very different thing from like, any number of Marxist writers, will I don't know, Soren Mao is just reading his book, right? Will like sort of throw around the term positivism as like a curse word, right? That this is
Yeah,
like,
and usually very crudely, right?
yeah,
I mean, don't get me wrong, I have my own critiques of positivism, but it's not responsible for all the evils of the world.
I mean, it usually just drives me crazy that I'm not quite sure what they mean
Yeah.
when they say it, but like that's like, oh yeah, well, you could be like a positivist, which is often like, which often seems to mean like caring a little bit too much about empirical evidence, and the details of arguments, and or you can have this like
All that bourgeois shit, right?
yeah, or you could have this like special, Hegelian Marxist dialectical way of finding the truth, right? So that's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from Rorty. And I guess in setting up this opposition, I am, implicitly stacking the deck for like the view that like the, right way to think of this is probably somewhere in between those two, but like which my sense is you would agree with, but I also think that you uh I also think that, you know, even if both of us are somewhere in between those, I think the place I am somewhere in between those, there's a little bit more emphasis on, okay, like there might be like sort of valuable insights that you get from this framing, but also like we really need to translate it into sort of ordinary talk of, causes and effects and
Sure.
mechanisms and all that stuff, to evaluate whether it's right. And then, my sense has been that, you sort of, as a matter of degree, kind of be like, no, let's keep it a little bit more Hegelian a little longer, and like really like linger on that, because like, there's like interesting stuff to be found there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Marx himself signals his debt to Hegel on numerous occasions, not just because he wrote a book-length critique of him, but in the preface to the second edition of Capital, I think is what it was. I might be wrong about that. He described himself as a pupil of that mighty thinker, which he very, very rarely does about anyone else, right? Every now and then he'll, of course, acknowledge debts to Aristotle, Smith, Ricardo, et cetera, et cetera. But I can't think of any other instance where he says, I am the pupil
Yeah,
of Smith,
totally.
Ricardo, et cetera. So it's quite a high compliment. And then he goes on, of course, to say that Hegel mystified the dialectic and was an idealist and all those nasty things. And so my approach is in many ways the inverse of his. But just in terms of kind of clarifying what I think is
Sure.
the valuable kind of insight that Marx takes from Hegel. I think that when Hegel and Marx understand something dialectically, there are many meanings to that.
Yeah.
Just the one that may be important for this chapter is recognizing that they're criticizing linear understandings of causality, where you say A causes B, causes C, causes D, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not because they think that linear approaches to causality are fruitless or useless, obviously, but it's because when you're examining the social totality, they become very constraining because we don't recognize how everything exists in a relation with everything else and is both caused by and recurses back and causes changes and everything else. Now, this is obviously a much more complicated vision of how things work, but it's extremely generative, right?
Yeah.
So to just talk again about the
Sure.
structure of
Yep.
capital, Marx would say, look, a simplistic way of looking at capitalism would say production is what causes consumption, and consumption is what in turn causes production, et cetera, et cetera. And Marx would say, well, no, actually, right? If you're kind of approaching examining the social totality from this kind of clearly delineated way, then you're not going to recognize how actually there are a lot of complicating factors that exist at every level of that kind of analysis, right? And it could very much be the case that shifts in, say, the historical bases of the state can lead to transformations in production, which can, of course, then lead to changes in consumption, which will then recurse again back into the sphere of production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really what he's getting at with this idea of dialectics, right? That we have to examine things from a totalizing kind of perspective and not just rest easy with the idea that A causes B, causes C, causes D. And how that's germane, I would say, to this chapter, since I know you wanted me to talk about this. I think what he's criticizing here is a kind of what I broadly call a neo-Lockean approach to understanding the relationship between labor, exchange, and then consumption. And interestingly, Marx himself has been criticized by some liberal political economists and political scientists as a kind of vulgar Lockean, right? Or as Ian Shapiro once put it, a kind of minor post-Lockean was the way he described Marx. Now, I have a lot of respect for Ian Shapiro, but I think that couldn't be more misguided because what Marx is doing here is saying, look, there's this very simple Lockean story that you can tell about labor, exchange, etc., which is I pour my labor into something and then I gain property rights to it, and then I might decide to exchange that with other people, and that way I gain something that I want, and they gain something that they want. And all of this is done freely and to the mutual benefit of all.
Yeah.
And what he's expressing here is that actually what we can see in many instances is even if labor is exchanged for its value on the market at any given time. And he's very insistent about that, right? That the minimum wage, for example, is set by the laws of the market, or what the average wage is set by the laws of the market. So it's not that the capitalist thinks that they're exploiting the worker by paying them whatever the market price for labor is at any given time. The problem, of course, is that labor has this capacity to generate more value, which the capitalist then expropriates as surplus value and uses to, as pointed out here, either enrich themselves or reinvest it in order to accumulate more capital, right? And it's this kind of relation, right, that exists in capitalism that enables these kinds of exploitation. And it's just something that doesn't appear in the much more linear Lockean story. And in order to understand it, we need to grasp under what social conditions the relation between capital and labor emerges. And if you don't grasp that, you can't understand the power disjunction between them that enables the capitalist to exploit labor in this way.
Right. All right. Yeah, that's helpful. Let's see. So we have
Starting with the washroom quick.
Okay. All right. So while he's doing that, Rorty, so Gareth says Rorty shared with Marx a love for a turn of phrase. That's definitely true. The complement passage is just a vivid way of asserting disquotationalism, which is respectable analytic classy position. We can say no more about truth than P is true, if only if P. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I will just say that it feels to me like Rorty is saying a bit more than that, but I suppose to properly evaluate that, we'd have to like go back and look at the essay. Politically, I think Rorty insisted on social democrat. That sounds right.
Oh, what does it say? The complement passage is just a way.
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily sold on that. It seems to me that Rorty, a lot of his rhetoric on pragmatism about truth, um, he does seem to
Uh,
be saying a bit more than that, because because disquotationalism, right? You're saying, um, it's like, okay, like all we're doing when we say snow is white is we're attributing whiteness to snow, right? That like, what, so in other words, we're making the same statement when we say, quote, snow is white, unquote, is true, as we are when we say snow is white without quotation marks. But that, at least in the usual presentation of it, right? We seem to be assuming mind independent facts in a way that Rorty, at the very least, seems to want to like complicate or express some degree of skepticism about.
mhm. So if I could interject
Yeah,
there,
yeah, please.
I think I'm going to avoid the temptation to do a whole lecture on this because I'm quite interested in pragmatism, or at least I was. I think what Rorty is criticizing, to use his famous metaphor, is this mirroring propensity that he thinks certainly analytic philosophers are given to. And he suggests, look, for a very long period of time, the assumption was that thought mirrors the world. This is the kind of he calls it Kantian. I think that's problematic, kind of instinct that a lot of analytical philosophers have. And there was this temptation at a certain point to say, well, with a linguistic turn, an early 20th century English-speaking philosopher, we kind of overcame that. But Rorty would say, and here's the positivism bit of it, that actually, no, right? All that we did was ascribe to language the same mirroring function that philosophers once did to thought, because the inclination was to say that language needs to hook on to the world, say the way that the early Wittgenstein presupposed, right? That language paints a picture of the world, which the later Wittgenstein famously criticized.
Right.
And Rorty's propensity is not to say that language doesn't sometimes mirror, right? Obviously, it does in some circumstances. He's just saying that very little of great interest emerges from understanding thought or language that way, precisely because so many of these truth statements that we make about pretty much anything don't correspond to it. And an example he gives that I think is helpful, he said, is I'm going to use a slightly different set of terms, but take a statement like genocide is bad, that most people take to be morally true.
Sure.
And then another statement like The Godfather is a great movie, another statement that most people take to be true. And then a statement like H2O consists of hydrogen and oxygen molecules, and then 2 + 2 = 4. All of these are statements that we claim to be true in some way, shape, or form. But he says it's extremely difficult to say in what sense they are all true or in what quality of truthness they all share. And he says the mirroring understanding of truth that's implicit within the early positivist and the kind of Kantian's understanding just does very little to explain, why genocide is bad, is a true statement in the same way that The Godfather is a great movie is also a true statement. So he just says that really we should change the conversation from these efforts to kind of pin truth down to these kinds of mirroring functions. And like you, I think that he's kind of mistaken about what a lot of these people are doing, and that his propensity to just say, let's abandon trying to ground truth in anything more than saying it's a compliment that we pay to statements that seem to be working for ourselves. I just think that that's kind of a cop-out. But
yeah, I mean, I think that this seemed to be working is the key part there that makes me think.
Yes,
yeah, that like it because
I'm always like, well, why are they working? They probably are working because they're getting at something that's a little bit more than
that they're like that they're, because it's like I'd be tempted to say that they're working because they are succeeding in describing external reality, but
yes, that's my propensity too.
But in any case, back to the 19th century. I one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we got Matt in on while we've got him is the Marx's commentary in this chapter on two of the most important uh, English speaking, philosophers of the century before Rorty, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
We all know how much Marx loves Bentham, right? It's just such a productive dialogue between them.
Yeah. Speaking of fuck that guy, yes. So we We first met utilitarian philosopher and liberal social reformer Jeremy Bentham in Capital at the end of chapter 6 in one of the most striking passages of the whole book, which we've already referred to. Right, so it says the sphere of circulation or commodity exchange within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on is in fact a very Eden of the rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, right? So
Yeah.
in that sentence, right, Bentham is being used as just kind of a byword for the pretensions of free market economics to that the invisible hand to wildly mixed metaphors lifts all boats, all that stuff, right? I guess a hand could do that. Big hand, could lift all boats. So then Bentham goes away for about 500 pages, and then he comes back in this chapter where Marx says, classical political economy has always liked to conceive social capital as a fixed magnitude of a degree of efficiency, right? Doesn't have a theory of accumulation. This prejudice was first established as a dogma by the arch Philistine, Jeremy Bentham, that soberly pedantic and heavy-footed oracle of the common sense of the 19th century bourgeoisie.
I just love that too, because it's like, man, we start with dogma, so it's like, oh, already this is bad, and then it's arch Philistine, woo boy, soberly pedantic, heavy-footed oracle, common sense in quotation marks, and then of course that's that venomous use of bourgeoisie. It's like, man, he's just dripping venom in that one, right? Just loading up the insults one after the other.
Yeah. Bentham is among philosophers what Martin Tupper is among poets. Now, Martin Tupper was not in the syllabus of any English lit class I ever took, but going with that little note in the Penguin edition, it seems to be the case that Martin Tupper was somebody who wrote what were supposed to be sort of instructional poetry that's not very good, right? I mean, you sort of get the sense that saying that he is to philosophers what Martin Tupper is to poets is a little bit like saying that he is to philosophers what Bob Ross was to painters. It's the happy little trees.
Yeah, it's kind of like sitting there and saying, Eat, Pray, Love is great literature, right? It's just like, all right.
Yeah, exactly, right. That's he did the Eat, Pray, Love of political economy. All right. So yes, and actually cuts off there, but he says there's a little jab at England at the end, right? Both could only have been, made in England. So obviously Marx is one of the great haters in literary history, just one of the all-time haters, as I always think of the line in the letter to Ingalls when they're gossiping about his factional opponent Bakunin. And he says that Bakunin has become a great mass of flesh.
Yeah.
And he married the Polish girl who took pity on him, and he just like goes on in that vein.
Yeah.
And so he does also have a slightly more philosophically interesting critique of Bentham's version of utilitarianism in the footnote to this passage, which we can loop back around to later. But what I really wanted to get Matt to weigh in on here is some of the stuff about Bentham's godson and intellectual heir, John Stuart Mill, who, by the way, fun fact, I always like to tell people in intro philosophy classes, John, so yes, Bentham was John Stuart Mill's godfather, and John Stuart Mill was Bertrand Russell's godfather. So it's just a fun chain of atheist godfathers there.
Yeah, pretty impressive pedigree, that's for sure.
So we've seen Mill and also his dad, James Mill, who's also a big utilitarian and political economy guy. So we've seen the Mill's father and son regularly pop up in these pages as Marx, among Marx's many go-to bourgeois economist punching bags, right? This is like the 20th time we've seen Marx talk about Mill. So let's start with an example from this chapter that's, again, I think independently interesting because it takes us back to the Hegelian point we were on just a minute ago, but I think is also like a representative sample of how Mill is treated in Capital. And then after that, we can look at a passage that complicates it a little bit. But let's start with this one, right? So the context here is he's talking about Senior, who is the guy you remember from chapter 10 in the Working Day, right? With the theory of how all the profits are made in the last hour. That's of course that Marx gives like a sort of a priori debunking, and then he of like why he thinks the argument doesn't work, and then he says like the ever since the factory acts were passed and the economy didn't crash, this is kind of a settled issue. And he says the factory inspectors are constantly mocking the industrialists by reminding them of this thesis about the last hour, that you can't shorten the working day at all, because then there'd be no profit whatsoever. And so Senior has that guy, has this whole thing where he like reframes capitalist profit as this virtuous abstinence, because capitalists are saving the money to reinvest it and creating jobs and growing the economy instead of just blowing it all on personal consumption. And Marx spends a great deal of this
As many
chapter.
hookers and coke as you can get your hands on, right?
Yeah.
Or as much hookers and coke as you can get your hands on.
Yeah, it's many hookers, much coke, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, Marx spends a lot of this chapter sort of making fun of that idea, right? It says, well, hold on, if you're, this is not exactly an act of selflessness, to uh, reinvest your money to make more money.
Yeah.
And he has this whole thing about how, like, I guess if you want to frame it this way, every time you're using something for one thing instead of another, you're abstaining from the other thing. So it's like,
Yeah.
so walking is abstaining from idling, sleeping is abstaining from waking, and he actually has like one of the real zingers in the chapter is the thing about how are the slave owners of Georgia, USA, virtuously abstaining when they use the money to buy whips, to get more, to get more labor out of the slaves. So this is the larger context, right? He's introducing Mill in. And he says that Senior's claim about abstinence was rather too much for the adherents of the old classical school of political economy. So he quotes this Cazenove saying Mr. Senior is substituted for profit, the labor and profit, the expression labor and abstinence, and Cazenove is objecting to this, right? It's not capital, but the use of capital productively, which is the cause of profits. And then he accuses Mill of wanting to have it both ways. And he says, John Stuart Mill, on the contrary, both copies Ricardo's theory of profit and annexes to it Senior's remuneration of abstinence. He is as much at home with absurd and flat contradictions as he is at sea with Hegelian contradiction, which is the source of all dialectics, which is a sentence that's worth zooming in on, for a couple of reasons, right? One of which is that it's like almost the only time in this entire book he actually uses the word dialectics. There's like, yeah, there's very, very few other, I think I checked at some point earlier in the class, and there's like, I don't know, like 3 places maybe where, like I think there are like maybe 2 places in the main text where he uses dialectical, and when he says dialectical, the context is pretty much always like the phrase dialectical inversion, right? In other words, like something turning into its opposite. So yeah, this might be the only use of the word dialectics in Capital. And one of the other things that makes this sentence interesting to me is because he doesn't one of many things that Marx never gets around to in his life is in fact, as Harvey points out, right, he never writes a handbook on dialectics.
He actually, at one point, and this is to your reference about him never completing anything, proposed that he was going to write, as he put it, a short work on dialectics that would clear up all the muddle, right?
That would have been nice.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. And then, sadly, he never got around to that, right? Probably the closest that you can get, in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of people, is the opening chapter of the Grundrisse, where he does a pretty good job of unpacking his method, especially in the last 10 pages or so of chapter 1. But even that, it's pretty inadequate to the kind of scope of the task. Also, he never published that book, so it's a little bit
you're
shaky. Let's just put it that way.
because they're right. That's because ultimately you're talking about some notebooks that he never I mean, there's as you guys will see when we get to volume 2, there is a vast chasm between stuff
That's
that
right.
he considered ready for publication, stuff that he did not. And so all of these wonderful literary flourishes we're enjoying in volume 1 are just go away. But like, so yeah, you're right. I mean, I guess there's also, I mean, there are always tricky questions about how much of Engels it's safe to assume that Marx agreed with him about. But the chapter on dialectics and the anti-during, I mean, I think there is like a little note that that like Marx like looked over it or whatever, right? So it's like maybe that, right? But yeah, he says very little about it, which itself makes this sentence interesting, because especially it makes it interesting in terms of the contrast that some later Marxists want to draw between, the dialectical method and what they consider to be, positivism, or people will say things like, I mean, again, I'm thinking here about Trotsky, about like, well, there's like Aristotelian logic, which is this huge oversimplification, and then there's like Hegelian logic, which is the good stuff. And it seems to me that in this sentence, Marx is drawing Marx, if what you mean by Aristotelian logic is like logic in the sense of what you learn when you take a logic class in college, right? That, stuff like, stuff that Aristotle talks about, like the law of, non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle and all that, right? If that's what you mean by Aristotelian logic, it seems to me that what Marx is saying in this sentence implicitly is, well, no, Aristotelian logic and Hegelian logic aren't competing theories of the same subject, right? These are just different subjects, right? Because the contrast he's drawing here between absurd and flat contradictions and Hegelian, and he even puts it in scare quotes, contradiction, right? Like, he seems to be saying pretty clearly that, whatever contradiction means in the Hegelian context, it really has nothing to do with what we mean when we talk about like logical contradictions. That would be the absurd and flat contradiction.
Yeah, I think there's an enormous amount to be said here. So I'll try to be brief, right? I personally think that Marx clearly has varied views on John Stuart Mill, right?
Yeah.
In this particular passage.
Yeah, we're about to get to the qualifier, but yeah.
Exactly, right? He's extremely scathing of Mill, and you almost think that he's about to lump him with other vulgar economists. Then later on, he actually says, well, no, that's clearly not the case, right? So for those who aren't familiar, Mill wrote quite an interesting book, A System of Logic, which is about a system of logic, but at the end, he actually lays out a lot of his methodology for social science, which is related, of course, to the way to think through things properly. And by and large, Mill is quite interesting. And I put this out actually in the liberal socialism book because he toes the line between being a methodological individualist and a methodological collectivist, and isn't quite sure which kind of camp to kind of locate himself in. He leans, for the most part, towards methodological individualism by saying most social laws need to be understood first and foremost as extrapolations from individual human psychology and propensities. Nonetheless, he says they assume a kind of law-like character of their own, which then recurs back into human psychology. But you have to kind of start from that individualist standpoint. Now, how does this relate back to the kind of Hegel point? Now, Marx reads Mill in that book and elsewhere, like the Principles of Political Economy, as largely assuming, like Bentham, that human needs are transhistorical and pretty basic to everyone, because he starts from this kind of individualist, particularly British individualist standpoint, and projects onto individuals the kind of aspirations of 19th century bourgeois economists, right? Everybody wants to make a lot of money so that they can consume an awful lot, that kind of thing, which I think is an error, actually, when it comes to what Mill's own philosophy was about. But from a kind of Hegelian standpoint, he makes kind of 2 points, right? First is the fact that a lot of human needs are set by social circumstances and conditions, right? The reason why a lot of women today might want a Gucci bag, and this is back to the point about feminism, isn't because it's a kind of trans-hysterical feature of human psychology that people just want Gucci bags, right? It's because
bring a DeLorean loaded with Gucci bags, back to the 19th century. Everybody want one.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's because there's a particular kind of fetish that we ascribe to Gucci bags in the present era. And there, I think Marx is on pretty solid ground criticizing, if not Mill, certainly Bentham, right? But on the point about Hegelian contradiction, I don't think there is any kind of incompatibility with what we call formal logic, whether in its Aristotelian or kind of a Millsian frame. And just to kind of pay Mill a compliment, his thinking on logic is still very relevant, right? Kripke used to refer in dialogue with it at great length, although usually to criticize it. So it's worth reading if you want to take a look at the book. But when Marx is talking about contradictions, he's not even talking necessarily about what Hegel is talking about. What he's describing are real contradictions, right? Contradictions that kind of express themselves in social conditions and social practices. And this is, of course, different than a logical contradiction, which is an error in thought, okay, just to put it very simply. So an example of a social contradiction would be actually something that is gestured to in this book, the way that capitalists invariably tend to see the people working for them as workers, while not recognizing that the minute they leave the factory, those same workers become consumers, and they want them to spend an awful lot of money in order to extract profits from that. But they're not going to be, workers aren't going to be able to do that unless they're paid a sufficient wage to consume as much as possible.
Right. And Marx taking us into volume 2 territory.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so Marx thinks this isn't a contradiction in thought on the parts of the capitalists. It's a social contradiction because they cannot but treat their workers as workers when they're in the factory and want to expand the working day as much as possible and pay them as few wages as possible because that is what the system drives them to do. Right. And they also cannot but hope that the minute they leave, somehow those same workers are all going to become multimillionaires and decide to consume as much as possible. So the only way to resolve this contradiction isn't through thinking through it more properly. Because, again, you can't just, because he says even just paying the workers more isn't going to resolve it in the long run, because competitive factors will eventually lead them to want to depress wages again. This is why I think thinks Owenism isn't going to work long term, right, under capitalist social conditions. The way to resolve this isn't, again, through policy changes or thinking through it differently. You need to transition to a new mode of production where the contradictions that are inherent to capitalism will no longer be present because we resolve them socially and through practice.
Right. Yeah, that's perfect.
Which is different, by the way, than Hegel also, I should say, to a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, so it's, the usual way of, so maybe let's clarify that last comment, right? So the usual way of thinking about the Marx-Hegel distinction on dialectics is that structurally it's going to be the same. It's just that it's just like, apply, that it's the, that, we're applying it to different things because Marx thinks that material factors are going to be like the motor force of developments that, Hegel, I'm sure brutally simplifying this bit of the history of philosophy, right, thinks that, that what goes on in the realm of, ideas or spirit is going to be the motor form, right? So is that what you mean, or do you have like a different distinction in mind?
That's what Marx seems to mean, right? Now, I want to be clear. My friend Borna Radnick wrote a really good book that came out just a few weeks ago, actually, called Freedom in Context, where he points out that he thinks Marx's misreading of Hegel, that's what he calls it, was one of the great misreadings in history because it was so generative for him to kind of treat Hegel as an idealist so that he could kind of formulate his own materialist standpoint in contrast to it. But Borna thinks that actually Hegel is a lot more Marxist than Marx himself acknowledged. Okay. Maybe that's true. He makes a pretty compelling case for that in the book. But the standard way of treating this and what Marx himself seems to think is, look, for Hegel, it's not that, we can think through the contradictions that emerge in society either, right? It's not like Hegel himself is going to solve all of Europe's problems by presenting the logic, right? The greater are the lesser logic, or presenting the phenomenology of spirit. They do need to resolve themselves historically. But ultimately, the primary way that they're going to resolve themselves historically is through ideational changes, right? We've applied certain kinds of norms in one circumstance, and then those norms evolve and change over time, and the new set of norms that we ascribe to society will be better because they'll be more emancipatory, more egalitarian, et cetera, et cetera. This is the way that Marx is understanding or reading Hegel. And of course, from Marx's standpoint, that's incorrect, right? Because what really needs to change is the forces of production initially, which then come into conflict, of course, with the relations of production, where those kinds of norms are embodied. And eventually, this contradiction is going to lead to sufficient social crises that's going to lead to a new mode of production and a new social form emerging, right? And that's quite different from something like the Marxist reading of Hegel, where no, the norms change first. If you were doing a Hegelian reading of the economy, you'd say, what's a lot more important than changes in forces of production is normative changes in the relations of production. And we can independently shift those without, needing to develop the forces of production initially.
Right. I should say, by the way, that whereas Marx did not find the time to write his short treatise on dialectics that would have cleared everything up.
Yeah.
One thing that I did learn from Vanessa Will's book, Marx's Ethical Vision, is that he did find time to write a manuscript stretched into hundreds of pages called Heroes of the Exile that was entirely devoted to making fun of like other German political exiles in London he didn't like.
That's kind of what I mean, right? It's like, yeah, Marx, maybe rather than like whipping Proudhon, like for the umpteenth time, you could just write that fucking book on dialectic, right? I really feel that that's a lot more important than being like, okay, I'll get to that. But like first, I really have to fucking get him like one last time, just to fucking point out how much of a fucking asshole he is. Right?
Yeah.
All right, like, I get it. You really fucking don't write Proudhon, but you already did a whole book on it.
Said, maybe listen to Engels when he's like harassing you, like starting the early 1870s about like when you're gonna like finalize volumes 2 and 3.
Yeah, exactly. But it is what it is.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so this is beyond being interesting for what Marx is saying, or at least implying about how he's thinking about dialectical contradictions. This is a pretty representative sample of the way that he will often slam John Stuart Mill and Mill's book, The Principles of Political Economy, in Capital. But in this same chapter, in a later footnote, you get this interest in backing off, right? That he says in his Principles of Political Economy, and it's actually slightly confusing. I haven't been able to track this down because Capital comes out in 1867, but this says 1868 edition, so I'm not 100% clear how that works, but I think it is probably relevant.
Oh yes,
that he's citing what was at this point a recent edition of the Principles of Political Economy, because the differences between Mill as Mill evolves to the left on economics, the editions of that book, the views change substantially.
Yeah, Gary Dorian has a really nice quote on this. By the way, everyone should read Gary Dorian's book on social democracy. It's extremely helpful as a guide to the history of socialist thought. Long, but rich. Anyway, he says, each edition of the Principles of Political Economy was, I had a quote, more socialist than the last, right? So, and that's what I think this is gesturing to, where Marx distinguishes between Mill's past views and his more modern views, which seems to be a grudging acknowledgement that, well, maybe he's not as much of a bourgeois apologist and a blockhead as I thought, because he seems to be moving in the right direction, even if you think Mill is still making some pretty fundamental errors in terms of his own socialist commitments. I think Marx is, again, being a bit too harsh on Mill. I think that Mill is actually a lot more aware of some of the problems that Marx is going to draw attention to in his critique of Mill than is accepted. But, when sure. Marx is on a hate, he's not really prone to backing off. And sometimes the best you're going to get from him is this very grudging acknowledge that, like, well, maybe he's not as stupid as I think.
Yeah, exactly.
As I thought before.
Right. So in his Principles of Political Economy, 1868 edition, page 128, John Stuart Mill says this: the produce of labor is apportioned at present in an inverse ratio to the labor. The largest portions to those who have never worked at all. The next largest to those whose work is almost nominal. right? Think here about, Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh being like, I don't understand why people want to retire. I want to work until I die.
Yeah.
And so, in a descending scale, the remuneration dwindling as the work grows harder and more disagreeable until the most fatiguing and exhausting bodily labor cannot count with certainty on being able to cover even the necessaries of life, right? So again, think about that, scale from, people who are, I just watched this documentary, I think it's from like the early 2000s sometime, but I just saw it a few weeks ago, called Born Rich, which is made, actually it's by the guy who made it is like the heir to the Pfizer fortune, actually. And
Yeah.
he so like I said, it's from like 2006 or something, I don't remember exactly, but they have but in that, it's all sort of framed around he's about to have his 21st birthday, and obviously has this really lavish party, but it's like also feels very weird because it's like he's the the family decided a long time ago to leave the running of business to other people, so so it's like he's not expected to work in any way, and like his and there like there's scenes in the documentary where he's like his his dad's like, well, I have like a stamp collection, that's like a kind of work, it's like,
Yeah.
and he interviews a very young Ivanka Trump, who in 2006, that's where she tells the story about her passing by a homeless guy outside Trump Tower, and Donald tells her, because he was like going through one of his bankruptcies, that man has more assets than I do right now.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, none of the people in that documentary, most remuneration, uh, you go down to your Matt Walsh's, with their strenuous podcasting work, still a lot of remuneration. You get down to people like picking lettuce, and you're cannot count on with certainty on being able to earn even the necessaries of life. And after having quoted this passage, which obviously is very simpatico with what Marx himself is saying, Marx says, to avoid misunderstandings, I love this, to avoid misunderstandings, let me say that while it is quite right to rebuke men like John Stuart Mill for the contradiction between their traditional economic dogmas, this is such an interesting turn of phrase, their modern tendencies, it would be very unjust to lump them together with the herd of vulgar economic, bourgeois economic apologists. So if you find anybody who wrote a book on political economy where they did do exactly that lumping, like the last 30 times they mentioned John Stuart Mill, tell them Marx doesn't like it, this is, it is pretty funny that this is like so many mentions of Mill deep.
Yeah. No. I mean, well, there are a few things to be said about this. I mean, one of the reasons why he keeps going back to Mill is Mill's Principles of Political Economy was a bestseller in the 19th century. Kind of hard to believe because it's not exactly gripping reading, let's call it that. But it's considered to be a very lucid exposition of its subject matter, and everyone wanted a piece of it, which is precisely why it went through numerous editions, even in Mill's lifetime, and substantial editions, right? He kept on revising it, Claude Dorian's point, in a more left direction, as this kind of quote that Marx is setting indicates. And this is why I think that had Marx encountered more of Mill's writings on things like socialism, he might have actually been more sympathetic still to him. Although, as we all know, Marx could also be very nasty to other socialists when he disagreed with them. So we'll put a pin in that, let's say. So in the chapters on socialism, Mill is actually even more emphatic about the point that's gestured to here, where he says, look, there's this deep contradiction between what we might call bourgeois morality, which holds, and we talked about this in the discussion yesterday, which holds that, hard work should be the basis of reward, which has a kind of Lockean undercurrent to it again, and the actual practices of bourgeois capitalist society. This is Mill speaking again. Why? Well, because as he points out here, it's very often the case that the hardest jobs that are also very necessary for social functioning, coal mining, sweeping the streets, today we'd add, picking lettuce, right? They are the ones that are least remunerated, whereas very many people, Mill points out, live idly on the wealth that are passed down to them from their forefathers, or they're aristocrats living in palaces, and they never have to work a day in their life. So Mill says, if we actually were to abide by the principles that we claim our society is predicated upon, hard work should be the basis of reward, things would be inverted from the way they are right now. But then Mill says, we're probably not going to undertake that change in line with what we say are our principles, because the rich don't want to, because why would they, right? And he's quite caustic about this in his own way, even if Mill was never quite as much of a gifted hater as Marx was.
Yeah. So I should say, yeah, we did spend quite a bit of time talking about Mill in the discussion yesterday, which will make it onto YouTube in not too long, but that so it is worth saying here, right? So there's this kind of like, if you're just kind of looking at this passage in isolation, right? You're like, oh, that's interesting. Modern tendencies, right? What are we talking about now, right?
And I want to add, Mill uses exactly that terminology in his autobiography, right? Where he says in the relevant section, when I was young, I could not see further than the kind of standard dogmas of political economy, which is why he wrote the first edition of Principles of Political Economy in what Marx would consider a pretty dogmatic way. And it was under the influence of socialist thought that he recognized it was possible to go beyond, this is the kind of terminology he uses, the kind of limitations of capitalist property relations. And this is why Mill says I would decidedly class myself under the kind of general designation of socialist, because now I do see further. I've kind of realized the error of my ways, as it were.
Yeah, right, exactly. So Mill, and this goes beyond, what Marx, I think, is aware of, right? I think that I mean, some of this stuff wasn't written until Marx died, and again, I think even the stuff that maybe was, he was mostly, I mean, I think what he knew best in Mill was the principles of political economy, but Mill, even granting that the S word, right, socialism could be even more flexible in the 19th century in some ways, right, than it is now, right, different people had very different things in mind,
Don't you know that Kamala Harris is a socialist Marxist fascist?
Yeah, I've heard as much, yes. But like, that there is real and interesting ideological overlap here with where Mill ends up, because even though, certainly, look, there's no equivalent, there's tons of stuff, and like, even when Mill takes his like final form economically, right, there's like tons of stuff there to criticize from Marx's perspective. Certainly there's nothing in Mill that's sort of similar to historical materialism, or like an idea of like class struggle is like the motor, that's going to get you, to the future society. But there really is like, there really is a very clear awareness in Mill as it goes on, that it's not just that, like what you see in this quote, that the distribution of income is all fucked up, right? But that the more fundamental issue is the way that production is organized. That in fact, Mill thinks that there's something like on sort of classical, Republican kind of grounds, right? Mill thinks that it's like that there's this degrading relations of servility and domination that are built into capitalist workplaces, and that it would be, whatever exactly the mechanism is by which he imagines this happening, right? It would at any rate be a good thing if the economy evolved away from that and towards, greater predominance of, worker co-ops and, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when Marx is criticizing the modern Mill, right? The kind of Mill who endorsed a kind of liberal form of socialism and wanted co-ops, he says the major problem with Mill is that he thinks that there's this analytical distinction one can make between distribution and production. And by the way, I think that there are people who make this mistake. I just don't think Mill is actually one of them. Because Mill says you can more or less, the relations of production that we have in capitalist society are transhistorical, right? You can't tinker with them because they're economic laws. But distribution is something that we can tinker with
Yeah.
because it isn't subject to the same kind of trans-historical economic laws. So you create a big economic surplus, and then rather than giving it back to the capitalists, Mill thinks that we can redistribute it through various kind of social programs. And Marx is very critical of this, saying this idea that there is such an analytical distinction between distribution and production is just nonsense. And I think this actually relates back to the Hegelian point earlier, because Marx would say the two are integrally linked to one another. So unless you see, if you can't just decide that you're going to change distribution and assume production will go on exactly the same way that it did before, right? If you really want to transform society, you're going to need to change both distribution and production simultaneously, right, in different ways. Now, I think that Marx is incorrect to charge Mill.
He's right about the point. He's wrong that it applies to Mill.
Exactly, right, because Mill, to this paragraph, does seem to be quite aware of the fact that relations of production really do matter, right? The reason why it is that the people who do work hardest in society don't actually get rewarded for their hard labor the way our morals say they should is because they're not in a position to demand more for themselves. And this is one of the reasons why Mill thinks that co-ops would be beneficial. And there are a lot of different reasons he gives for that. Now, I do think that, and this is to your point about historic materialism, Mill's understanding of what exactly is problematic about relations of production and why they emerged is really much less sophisticated than Marx. And his approach to resolving these problems is also quite a bit less sophisticated than certainly what some Marxists have come up with, right? But I think that this is going to be my most lived moment of the day. It would be a lot more productive to put the two thinkers into dialogue with one another to see how they can both strengthen each other and how there's gradations and nuances in both of their thinking than to position this kind of contrast between them, the way that Marx does in some of the passages, and the way people like David Harvey will sometimes say that Mill and Marx are just like kind of at exact cross purposes with one another.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think, I mean, for my money, some of the most interesting stuff being written about Marx in the 2020s, I'm thinking like that Citizen Marx book, right?
That's a very good book, yeah.
Yeah, is all about sort of you know, resuscitating the republicanism in Marx, you know, and so I think if you have that in mind, you do get I think some pretty interesting normative overlap, at least, you know, between Marx and Mill, that they have you know, at least sort of, you know, seeing, you know, late Mill, I'm saying, right? You know, that like saying that like the sort of fundamental issue with capitalism is not that, you know, it leads to this sort of terrible distribution, although it certainly does, right? You know, but like that's a symptom, right? That that this is you know, I mean, this is what Marx even says in the Critique of the Gotha Program, that you know, we shouldn't retreat to the position of the vulgar socialists who are, you know, too hung up on distribution, because he says, you know, that the distribution we have under capitalism is a result of the means of production being in the hands of non-workers, right? You know, like, so the sort of fundamental issue is the relations of power and domination at the site of production, which again, I think is something that Mill really comes around to. But
yeah, I'll chime in one thing and then I see we got questions. But
yeah,
I actually think that had Marx spent more time with Mill, particularly Mill's mature works, the On Liberty book, for example, or even his work on utilitarianism, right? What he recognizes, there actually is a kind of a normative overlap between their views as well, right? People like C.B. McPherson stressed this, right? So Mill is actually quite critical of, well, famously critical, I should say, of Bentham and Benthamite utilitarianism. He is less nasty in expressing that than Marx is, because Mill was just not temperamentally a very nasty guy. He tended to be pretty liberal in his approach to things in the best and the worst sense of the word. But Mill really foregrounds that, look, happiness does not just consist in the hedonistic gratification of desires and the avoidance of suffering, right? The way that the Benthamites insist. Because our first project, of course, is always ourself, right? Which means to individuate itself and express itself like a living tree that extends to all ends. And he actually appeals to the German philosopher Humboldt to say that One of the ways that we do individuate and express ourselves is through the development of our human powers, our capacities, which capitalism is not doing a good job of developing, especially for the poor. And Marx comes around to a very similar kind of normative view, both in this chapter, right, where he talks about how the free flourishing of the individual is only going to be possible in a higher form of society, and in Capital Volume 3, where he posits that socialism or communism is going to entail the development of human powers or capacities as an end in itself for the first time. So there's quite a lot, I think, of normative symmetry between Mill and Marx on the point of what is good for human flourishing or how human beings flourish, which kind of is a testament to the fact that if you lean more and more socialist, this is probably, I think, the view you're just going to naturally come around to.
Yeah, that seems right. All right. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. So, Kevin?
Yeah, hi. So I'm glad that, maybe not glad, but I see that dialectics are back on the menu for today. So I wanted to bring up some of the questions I had about this, completely new to me, and trying to understand this concept and specifically how it's useful for me. I know we talked about, you said that, Marx's view of a science is that it can close the gap between appearance and reality or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
I also would have thought that, part of it was being able to sort of predict things, right? Having some sort of predictive understanding. So
Sure.
when we talk about like dialectics, I see a lot of things described as dialectical. So like we talked today about this dialectical inversion of property relations. And you talked about systems that are sort of holistic, like I can't really understand the pieces in isolation. And there's certainly lots of systems in even natural sciences that are this way. But I don't know how the notion of describing them as dialectical or dialectic is helpful for me. How can I figure things out in this way?
Sure. Probably actually the most helpful work in this vein, for me at the very least, was David Harvey's 1990 work, Justice, Nature, and the Geography of Justice, Nature, and the Geography of, I can't remember what the last is, something. Anyway, he actually, it's an inconsistent book. It covers probably too many topics, but there's this really brilliant kind of description, I think, of how Marx understands dialectic as relation rather than linear causation in that. And just to give a kind of example of how this could be understood ontologically, Harvey says, think about a tree, right? You could sit there and say that water or soil causes, a seed to sprout into a tree. But that doesn't really appreciate the relation between the nutrients that it's sucking up and then also, the kind of genetics that are inbuilt within the seed that give it the potential to turn into the tree under the right kinds of conditions. And Harvey says that Marx tends to understand social science as from a similarly kind of dialectical perspective, right? Just to go back to my previous example, you cannot say that production causes consumption, right? Because nobody would produce unless they thought there was going to be someone to buy. You need to understand that it's a relation, right? That the sphere of production relates to the sphere of consumption, and that there are recursive forms of causation that exist between them and all of the other kinds of social forces that are at work in society. So the way that Harvey depicts this pictographically is that you should understand society from Marx's perspective less as a kind of linear chain of things that are kind of bound together and more something like an onion or a spiral, right? Circles within circles within circles that are concentric, each one kind of causing one another, relating to one another, sometimes getting a bit more distant from one another.
Yeah. So I think on the first part of your question,
I'm going to look up the final part of that.
Yeah. I think that, again, Marx does make a lot of comments about like the rule of science, or again, sometimes philosophy, not always sharply distinguished, being to
justice, nature, and the geography of difference. Okay, so I did have it
there
right. I just second guessed myself. Shouldn't do that.
There you go. That like that the role of science is about like eliminating illusions and letting us see reality as it is. And and look, I'm not I think that it's important to note that he says a bunch of things along those lines insofar as that can help us understand what Marx thinks he's up to. But I also think that like the sort of scattered comments and letters and stuff where he says that, it's like, look, I think Marx has lots of insights on lots of things, but I don't actually think this is a particularly plausible view about like the philosophy of science that, because for exactly the reason you said, right? I mean, like surely science is, like what we really want, which is doesn't necessarily track, right? Like that, it's not like, oh, we only need a science where there are these gaps between appearance and reality. It's like, no, sometimes we're just trying to get new information, and particularly to have models that are going to be predictive, right? So all of which is just to say, yeah, I think Marx is kind of wrong about this, but also I don't think it's a subject he thought deeply about, and
No.
I don't think a lot hinges on like him having a sort of overly simple description of this. I think it's just, again, important to sort of get what he's up to in some of these passages. As far as the question about the sort of helpfulness of dialectical framing, I mean, look, I'm again, I kind of indicated earlier, kind of a centrist about this, right? Like I think that I wouldn't go, I wouldn't go full Rorty and be like, oh, it's a shame that the most important political science economist in the 19th century is a philosophy major in college, right? Like I think that there are, I think that, what I would say.
Roddy really never missed a chance to like just take a dig at philosophy. Did it right?
No.
Just never miss a chance.
Yeah. What I would say is that it's that, I think that, because I think some of what you're getting at, right, is like, Michael Heinrich, who is a guy who's, Marx books I have numerous issues with, but, he has some good lines. And, and I remember Heinrich has one about how, I think he's like expressing frustration with Marxists who, sort of use dialectical to mean, I think the quote from Heinrich is something like, everything is connected to everything and it's all a bit complicated, right? That like, it's
You gotta add like a man at the end of it, right? Like everything is connected, man. Like we're all one. That's yeah, like it's always more complicated, man.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like it's not, that's like not very insightful, right? It's not very helpful. I think that like it's, so I'd say two things about like sort of in defense of the dialectical stuff in Capital. Which, so one is that again, I think like when you have like, you sort of, I think it's like maybe more helpful you sort of zero in on like particular notions like contradiction. Say, okay, what does this mean, right, in context? And I think Matt said this earlier, and it's correct, right, that there are probably a few different things that even in Marx's hands it means in different contexts.
Oh, that's for sure.
But like one of the main things that it means, right? So is, I know I've like quoted this before in class because I really, a book that I'm always trying to get everybody to read is the Eric Olin Wright,
Reconstructing Marxism.
exactly, Reconstructing Marxism.
Oh, I haven't read that one yet.
That was very, very good.
Yeah.
And in the Eric Olin Wright, Andrew Levine, and Elliot Sober, right? Who I didn't even know before I read that book that Sober was interested in Marxism. But yeah, but yeah, I think the Reconstructing Marxism discussion of contradictions is very good, right? It says like, okay, so like one of the things that contradiction often means in Marx's hands is that you have a system that has multiple conditions for its realization that either can't be simultaneously fulfilled over time, or that to the extent that one is fulfilled, it undermines the ability of the other one to be fulfilled, right? And that's like that's something that's like, yeah, okay, that's a useful concept, right? Like I think that and I say that, okay, ultimately, if you want to know whether something he's saying about contradictions is correct, again, I think you do want to like translate that into the language of just regular cause and effect mechanisms. But I mean, I think that's something that you can wrap your head around. And I think that the other thing I want to say is, this is not necessarily, because if your question is like, oh, what good is it going to do me to start talking this way? Well, I'm not necessarily recommending that you start talking this way, right? But like, I think if the question is kind of how to approach Marx talking that way, and and how to how to sort of like get out of it the most that you can, or sort of like how to think about how it relates to the rest of what he's saying. What I
Well,
would,
I think what the part where I'm confused is if it's just new vocabulary and I
yeah,
can identify it, like say,
sure,
oh, that's an apple, fine. Then I learn what the word apple means.
sure,
But if it's actually a way of thinking, like an
right,
independent method, I don't understand that.
I think, okay, so I think it definitely is an independent method. It's just not one that, unfortunately, is spelled out with any kind of systematicity by Marx himself. So it's been left in the hands of later Marxists to try to use Wright's term, reconstruct it, right? And the problem, of course, is that since Marxists tend to disagree with one another, what one Marxist says about what Marx's method is will not necessarily be expected by everyone else, right? But in terms of this language of contradiction, I can understand why one would approach it with a certain degree of skepticism, because it seems to be taking a term that's applied in one domain, logic, right? And ascribing it to the empirical world. But I think that there's actually a lot of value that comes from describing certain kind of social processes as contradictory, precisely because what Marx is talking about is systematic tensions that emerge from the inherent logic of a given system that cannot be satisfactorily resolved, right? Without breaking away from the parameters of the system itself. And a really good example of this that I always use when I'm teaching the subject matter is what I gestured to before, the contradiction of underconsumption, right? That when capitalists are in the factory, they see the people working for them as workers, and there's a lot of economic pressure imposed upon them to lower wages, right? Because how could there not be, right? The less that you pay them, the more surplus value you can end up extracting. But then at the same time, of course, is once their workers exit the factory, capitalists want them all of a sudden to become multimillionaires, right? Because that way they will consume more and they would increase profits. And Marx would insist there's never going to be an enduring way of resolving this kind of contradiction, precisely because whether capitalists are nice or whether they're mean, there's always going to be these systematic pressures imposed, even on people like Robert Owen, to decrease wages in order to extract more profit. Because if you don't decrease wages to extract more profit, one of your competitors is going to do so, and they're going to run you out of business, right? So the only way this can be resolved long-term, Marx thinks, is by transitioning to a new mode of production. Now, I want to be clear. There are some thinkers that have insisted that that is not necessary. A really good example of this is, of course, John Maynard Keynes, right? So John Maynard Keynes, it's debatable how much he knew Marx. Often he seemed to have a pretty low opinion of him. But there is no doubt that in the general theory, he lays out a very similar kind of problem to what Marx lays out when he's talking about underconsumption. And of course, Keynes' solution is to say, well, this is where the state need to step in to guarantee things like A, full employment, and B, high wages, precisely because individual capitalists are never going to have an incentive to do that themselves long-term because of the nature of economic competition. And of course, a lot of people took very seriously this kind of Keynesian program over the course of the 20th century, and it brought about what's sometimes called the economic golden age, right, of high wages, hyper-unionization, social programs that were also intended to make certain goods public, so more of a worker's income could be spent on consumption, all that kind of thing. Of course, that all ended in the 1970s for a bunch of reasons that we don't need to get into.
Yeah, so I would say that, was a lot of that I would co-sign. I think there might be disagreement here because I do think that, you asked, okay, are we ultimately talking about new vocabulary or are we ultimately talking about a method? And, Matt said, well, we're talking about a method. I would say that we're pretty much talking about new vocabulary. The reason for that pretty much, right? That failure to fully commit to saying all we're talking about here is vocabulary is that I do think that like this kind of dialectical idiom that Marx gets from Hegel, that like this is something that like if you're sort of speaking this dialectical language, it does kind of prime you
Yeah, that's true.
usefully, right? It primes you usefully to look for certain kinds of patterns of, like the sort of contradictions in the sense that Matt was talking about, like cases where something, sort of turns into its opposite by the, working out of its internal dynamics, whatever, right? And I think that that's, whatever. I mean, you can clearly OD on it, but like, I think that that's like too, but I think that like, I do think that part of the reason that Marx has certain kinds of insights that even other 19th century critics of capitalism don't is precisely because he does have that background. So,
I agree,
so
yeah.
he is very like primed to look for patterns of that kind, right? And in this case, it kind of works out, right? Because capitalism is in fact full of patterns of that kind. There's no a priori guarantee of that, right? I mean, it just just happens to be the case, right? And so again, I think that it's like I think there's like I think that this sort of suggestive dialectical framing does lead Marx to have certain important insights, but I ultimately don't think that like this adds up to a like method of finding the truth that's different from just kind of like looking at the evidence, constructing some cause and effect models, weighed arguments and counter arguments, right? I mean, this is kind of I mean, I know this was like forever ago. We did this in like the chapter 2 or 3 lecture or something, right? But like this was kind of the disagreement with like what David Harvey says about that and the companion that I was talking about like way back then.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other thing here, and then we should take Talal's question because
yeah, of course.
you and I have both been riffing on a lot of different things here. I think one of the reasons why Marx is attracted to this language of contradiction is precisely because in a lot of instances, he wants to offer a kind of non-normative critique of capitalism, which of course is going to generate all kinds of interesting problems later in the future, as you know. So when he's talking about contradiction, let's just go back to the problem with underconsumption. He's of course not suggesting here that the reason why underconsumption occurs is because every capitalist is rapacious,
right.
Just doesn't want to pay their workers more. He often writes that way, no doubt, right? I mean, just look at this chapter, right?
Sure.
But he says, there are clearly instances where capitalists might actually want to pay their workers more. Now, he doesn't think that that is going to resolve the problem, since, of course, again, you're still paying your subject population with the money that you stole from them. But he says the real reason why wages are lower is not because capitalists are bad people, but because of the economic pressures instilled by competition that impose themselves upon them, right? Again, if you pay your workers more, maybe that'll make you a nice person, but it does mean that the guy next door who's also in your line of work is going to undercut you by paying his workers less, and eventually he's going to drive you out of business, right? So this is why these contradictions emerge, irregardless of what people might want to do from a kind of normative standpoint. And it's why he thinks that utopian socialists that think all we need to do is develop the right norms for a more compassionate economy aren't really getting at the right way to understand why it is that we're in the situation we're in.
Yeah. Okay. Talal.
Hi. I wanted to talk about footnote 51, which is where Marx
is by delightful coincidence got that on the slide, right? So let's take a look at it.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so he says, just to recap for anybody who doesn't remember or, I'm horrified by the very thought of this, skip the footnotes. So it says, Bentham is a purely English phenomenon, not even accepting Christian Wolff, and no time and no country has the most.
That's also just so characteristically Marx, right? It's like he's insulting one person, but he's like, well, there's a little bit of time just to take a dig at someone else, right?
Yeah. No time and no country is the most common, the most homespun manufacture of commonplaces ever strutted about in so self-satisfied a way. The principle of utility was no discovery made by Bentham. He simply reproduced in his dull way what Bennius and various other Frenchmen had said with wit and ingenuity in the 18th century. And then, I mean, I'm guessing this is more the part you're asking about. I think, and this is the most interesting, right, ideologically interesting part of the footnote, right? He says, because he's giving this critique of Bentham, and interestingly enough, this is not exactly a critique of utilitarianism.
Yeah, it's not.
It's a critique of Bentham doing utilitarianism wrong, right? Like he said, because he's not actually questioning the principle of utility in this footnote. He's just saying, like, you're not doing the empirical part right, right? So he says, to know what is useful for a dog, one must investigate the nature of dogs. This nature is not itself deducible from the principle of utility. Applying this to man, he that would judge all human acts, movements, relations, etc., according to the principle of utility, would first have to deal with human nature in general, and then with human nature as historically modified in each epoch. Bentham does not trouble himself with this. With the driest naivete, he assumes that the modern petty bourgeois, especially the English petty bourgeois, is the normal man. And man, there's a lot to say about this, but let's get to your question.
Well, basically, I think that a lot of this note gets Bentham wrong, and probably we don't have time to get into all of that. But I think there is an interesting point here, which is if you think about 18th century philosophy and early 19th century thought, there is kind of this pantheon of thinkers who enjoy a good reputation on the left. If you think of people like Thomas Paine, for instance, you'll see him cited very favorably, and people like Wollstonecraft and others. But it's very interesting, I think, and worth pondering that, Bentham, despite his very advanced opinions, in some cases probably, more advanced than even Marx.
So they are musician.
If you look at what we have from him, he doesn't get into that club, and it's a very interesting point in my view. And I think part of it is to do with this, what Marx is saying here.
Yeah, I think
probably also, I suspect that as far as like late 20th century and afterward, leftist readers, that even people who are very distant from Foucault ideologically are probably influenced by the way that Foucault talks about Bentham.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So Elizabeth Anderson actually has a very good chapter on Bentham in a recent book, Hijacked, where she re-articulates the same critique, I should say, from a much more sophisticated standpoint than, unfortunately, you see Marx engage with here, right? When Marx talks about Bentham, he's almost invariably talking about a kind of Benthamite attitude, which I do think exists. I mean, you can still see it today, right? This idea that all human beings are just self-interested, rational hedonism pursuers, and we do this competitively, and to the extent that we gratify as many of our hedonistic urges over the course of our life successfully, we can be said to have led a pretty good life, and to the extent that we fail to do that, we can be said to have led a bad life. Now, to your point, Talal, no doubt Bentham sometimes writes this way, and you can be very critical of him for this. And I think that Marx is very accurately criticizing, again, the kind of trans-historical assumptions about what kind of things make people happy that a lot of Benthamites and a lot of utilitarians do engage in, right? They fail to recognize the kind of social nature of a lot of the desires that we pursue. On the other hand, I think that you're right, and that Ben is right, that it's not necessarily clear that Marx himself has a granular critique of utilitarianism as a kind of normative approach, precisely because there are a lot of instances in which utilitarianism can lead to progressive conclusions about a large number of issues, as it did in Bentham's case, right, where he used to say things like, there's no reason why we should disregard the interests of women the way that society does so frequently. Women experience pleasure and pain the same as men, so they should count as one in our felicity calculus the same as men. although no more than one, right? And a lot of people have criticized certain kinds of Marxists, certainly, for eventually becoming closet utilitarians. This was Alistair McIntyre's critique of kind of 20th century Marxist normative theory, where he said, whenever the Marxists are actually pushed to explain on what moral basis are you grounding socialism, it usually has a kind of utilitarian flavor, right?
And
Well, rather than just
certainly if you think about 20th century Marxist Leninism, there's a lot of there's a lot that sounds like a pretty crude version of act utilitarianism, where it's like, where it's like, well,
socialism is going to be more productive, and that means we're going to gratify more human desires, and that means that our system is going to be better.
Yeah, and if we have to, break a few human eggs along the way, that's like it can kind of feel like justifying pushing people onto trolley tracks, at a certain point. But one of the reasons that I found this footnote so interesting, right? So
it's a lot of fun. It's a really fun footnote.
Yeah, it's a very fun footnote, but even Grant Tool's point that this is an oversimplification of Bentham, it does, I think, take us interestingly back into the conversation about John Stuart Mill, because you kind of said this earlier, right? That the kind of look, put aside the insults, right? Just like the actual substance, the critique of Bentham in this footnote, it actually sounds a lot like Mill's critique of Bentham.
Yes.
Again, in both cases, he's like, yeah, sure, he's Marx, whatever he might have thought about it, right? Separately, at least in this footnote, he is not quarreling with the principle of utility at all, right? He's just saying, well, if you're going to properly apply it, you need to know, and it's always a little tricky trying to figure out how to relate what Marx, mature Marx in the late 1860s, thinks to his young Marx in notebooks in the 1840s when he's talking about species being and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But this does kind of feel like that, right? That this is he's saying, the whole analogy about dogs, it's like that this is
also, I want to point out, contra Jordan Peterson and some conservatives, this is just another instance where Marx very clearly says there is such a thing as a permanent human nature.
Totally.
Right? It's not that, in the 19th century, it just became a different kind of creature. He's saying it's a very complicated relationship, right? That we have this kind of enduring materiality to us that kind of sets human nature. But there are different ways that expresses itself, given historical epochs, which I think is just obviously true.
Yeah, right. It's right there. It's human nature in general, right?
Yeah.
He clearly believes in human nature in general, although he also believes that there are ways in which it's modified under different historical circumstances. So, there are, people in the 9th century might not be that excited, when Doc Brown offers them the Gucci bags, but you can also go into any past century and, Marx clearly thinks that there are sort of some certain basic things about, what people want and what's gonna, how they're gonna flourish and all that stuff that are gonna be the same, right? And so yeah, I think that's a great point. He clearly does believe in human nature in a way that a lot of later Marxists are keen to deny, and certainly a lot of anti-Marxists assume that he denies. And what he's saying here again has a very Millian ring to me, right? That he's saying, okay, if we're going to properly apply the principle of utility, we need to have a theory of human flourishing, right? That it's the same way that we can only understand the utility of dogs when we understand the nature of dogs, that we can that they need the treats and walks and whatnot, that they have we can only, we need to have this insight into human psychology to understand what counts as maximizing utility for people, that which again, does, at the very least, it's very suggestive of overlap with the kind of thing that Mill's going to say about how, there are higher and lower kinds of pleasure, that that the sort of the kind of deepest, the deepest happiness that we have has to do with like our own like sort of project of self-creation and individual, perfection and all of that stuff, right? So, I mean, again, which goes to the point that if like Marx had dug in a little bit more to Mill's philosophical writings, he might have found more to like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just close by saying this about Bentham as a kind of critique, right?
Yeah.
First off, I think that there is no doubt if you ever read Bentham's work that he has a very narrow understanding of human nature and human psychology, right? He's almost deliberately reductionist about human psychology throughout the course of his work, right? Insisting that there are only two twin masters that guide all of our behavior, pleasure or pain, or the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. And this kind of inference can be used to explain more or less everything about what we do. And I think that Marx and Mill, for that matter, would both say that's just clearly wrong, right? There are a lot more variations in human psychology that we can see that it's necessary to account for if we're going to explain why people often don't pursue pleasure or don't actually even necessarily actively try to avoid pain. I mean, all kinds of people engage in self-destructive activities, and we need to grasp why. Now, in terms of the kind of normative critique of Bentham that we can make, Anderson, I think, makes very clear in her critique that Bentham has a lot of extremely reactionary impulses in his work that kind of belie its own progressive impulses in some circumstances. A very good example of this is Bentham is without a doubt extremely progressive when he insists on this very egalitarian principle that each is to count for one and no more than one in the philosophic calculus, right? That's a very progressive idea in many respects. But many people, even in the 19th century, pointed out that this might lead you in a socialist direction and say, well, wouldn't it be good then for people to more or less flourish equally? And shouldn't we design or try to instantiate an economy that would facilitate that? And as Anderson, McPherson, and many others point out, Bentham Ware will say, well, no, absolutely not, right? Precisely because even though each is to count for one and no more than one, we need competition in order to stimulate human productive activity. And if that means that there are going to be a large number of poor people in society, so be it. And he could be actually pretty Foucauldian, but this is to Foucault's critique about how the poor are meant to be managed in society. Anderson points out that his solution to poverty was more or less to say, build some giant workhouses where they can be sent, don't pay them anything, they only get food, and Bentham doesn't even allow that they're going to get nice clothes to wear because he worries that that is going to lead them to expect handouts. He says they should only get clothes that are hand-me-downs from others, and that'll really teach the poor to try to work harder. That will prevent them from kind of relapsing into their bad habits. And in moments like these, you can definitely appreciate Marx's kind of scathing attitude towards the kind of petty bourgeois moralism that's baked into a lot of his policy suggestions.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more that we could say about this, but we are more than a quarter of an hour over time, so we should probably leave off from there. If anybody has any other questions about anything Matt said today, you can certainly send them to me and I can pass them along. But
just email me,
or just email Matt. It's not a secret how to get in touch with them. Sure, he's got a website we can find that and whatnot. But
yeah, just look me up at U Michigan and you can find my email there.
Yeah. So let's see. Yep. Okay, so we got Kevin's question. Why Marx reduced his use of Hegelian dialectical language capital? Yeah, it's an interesting question, but yeah, perhaps best saved. For next time, for next week, as I said, chapter 25 is a monster. So I don't know how useful it's going to be to try to bite off vast chunks of it at once. And I'm not in a huge hurry. So my suggestion is that we just do the first two sections of chapter 25 for next time, if everybody's good with that. But if you are not, let me know. But yeah, if that feels about right to everybody, let's do sections 1 and 2 of chapter 25 for next week. And okay, cool. I will see you guys then. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.